The man accused of raping and murdering a child 30 years ago has pleaded guilty to the crimes. 8-year-old April Tinsley went missing from her Fort Wayne, Indiana home in 1988.
In the quiet streets of Fort Wayne, Indiana, fear struck on an ordinary April day in 1988 when a child disappeared without a trace. The Midwest town, usually filled with the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting, was soon gripped by terror as one little girl's disappearance turned into one of the most haunting mysteries it had ever seen. This is the story of April Marie Tinsley, an innocent 8-year-old who disappeared in daylight, with her tragic end unknown to everyone. Her abduction confused authorities for over 30 years, and as the years passed, her killer's twisted taunts sent waves of dread through the town. What started as an ordinary day had become a nightmare. The community found itself in the middle of a sad and haunting story, a case that left a deep mark on Fort Wayne and changed its people forever. April's story is about a young life taken, a community shattered, and a long fight for justice. On Friday, April 1st, 1988, 8-year-old April Tinsley looked forward to a day filled with fun and games. Spring had started in Fort Wayne, and April was eager to spend time with her friends. April was a bright, happy child and a third grader at Fairfield Elementary School, known for her cheerful personality. She lived with her mother, Janet Tinsley, in a modest home in the city's South End. It was a close-knit neighborhood where children felt safe playing outside. But the safety and innocence of that neighborhood would soon be torn apart. Around 3 p.m., April left a friend's house to get her umbrella just a few blocks away from her home. It was a short walk, one she'd made countless times before, but she never made it back. By the early evening, when April still hadn't returned to her friend's house, Janet Tinsley's concern grew into panic. Something was wrong. She frantically called neighbors and searched nearby streets, but there was no sign of her daughter. April had vanished without a trace. Janet immediately contacted the police, and a search was launched. 3 days later, on April 4th, the unimaginable occurred. A jogger discovered a horrific scene walking along a rural road in DeKalb County, which was about 20 miles north of Fort Wayne. The lifeless body of April Tinsley was lying in a ditch. She was dressed in the same clothes she wore when she disappeared. Her small frame was bruised and battered that revealed the brutal assault she had suffered. The autopsy confirmed the worst fears of the community, that April had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. This revelation sent shockwaves through Fort Wayne. Parents who used to let their kids play outside were now filled with fear, realizing an innocent child had been taken off the streets, murdered, and discarded like trash. The investigation into April's disappearance and subsequent murder was marked by meticulous attention to detail and a sense of urgency. The Fort Wayne Police, Indiana State Police, and the FBI worked together. They were determined to catch the person responsible. Investigators searched the neighborhood, talked to witnesses, and collected every piece of evidence they could find. They looked into local sex offenders and followed up on any tips they received. However, the killer seemed to disappear as quickly as April had. No one noticed anything strange on the day she was taken, and there were no suspects. As the tips stopped coming in, the case began to lose momentum. When April's body was found, investigators faced a huge challenge, like quickly gathering evidence before it could be lost or tampered with. Time was crucial, especially in child abduction cases, but each hour that passed seemed to push them further from finding the killer. Police launched a citywide search, but no clear suspects were identified. At the crime scene, investigators found crucial pieces of evidence. April's body had been dumped hastily, and her killer had left behind some genetic material. However, in 1988, DNA technology was still in its early stages. While samples were collected, they could only be analyzed to a limited extent. Witnesses were scarce. One young girl reported seeing a strange man driving a blue truck near April's house around the time she disappeared, but her description was unclear and not proper. Investigators built a profile of a potential suspect, but it wasn't enough to give them a clear lead. The case began to slow down, but the police never gave up, and April's family continued to push for justice. Fort Wayne in the late 1980s was in shock. April's murder wasn't just a tragic crime. In fact, it was a nightmare for every parent in the community. This didn't happen in some faraway place. It had happened in their own backyard on a quiet street in broad daylight. For the first time, parents kept their children indoors, warning them not to talk to strangers or stray too far from home. Worry spread throughout the city, as everyone wondered if and when the killer might strike again. April's funeral was held just days after her body was found, and it was an emotional event that drew hundreds of people. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had been touched by the story came to pay their respects. The church was filled with flowers, and April's small white coffin showed how short her life was. Devastated by the loss of her only child, Janet Tinsley could barely speak. Yet the community rallied around her, offering support in the face of such unspeakable loss. Despite all the sadness from the public, fear still remained. In the years following April's murder, several child abductions were reported in neighboring towns, though none were connected to her case. The uncertainty of when or if the killer would be caught was overwhelming for many. For Janet, each passing year without answers felt like a stab in the heart. Then, in 1990, something terrifying happened. 2 years after April's murder, a message appeared on the side of a farm near where her body had been found. Written in big and crude letters, the chilling message read, "I kill 8-year-old April M. Tinsley. Did you find her other shoe? Ha ha ha, I will kill again." This sickening taunt threw the case back into the spotlight. Whoever had taken April was still out there, and worse, they were boasting about it. The message sent shockwaves through the community once again, reviving fears that another child might become a target. The police worked tirelessly to track down the person behind the message, but again, the trail led nowhere. Whoever wrote it had managed to evade capture. For the next several years, April Tinsley's case seemed to sit in a strange uncertainty. While it was never closed, there were few active leads. Investigators sometimes received tips from psychics or people who thought they had seen April in other places, but none of those leads turned out to be helpful. For April's family, these years were filled with frustration and heartbreak. Janet Tinsley held on to hope that someday her daughter's killer would be found, but as time passed, it became harder to believe.
I'm really happy that this day arrived. I never was necessarily sure we would ever see the day or they would be able to find who did this. So it's a terrible thing that it happened, but I'm very happy there'll be peace for the family and for everyone who knew April.
The case began to feel cold, with no new leads or promising tips coming in. Every year on the anniversary of April's abduction, the local news outlets run stories to keep her memory alive, but there was little progress in the investigation. Each passing year made it more difficult for Janet to hold on to hope as she faced the painful reality that the man who had taken her daughter remained free. But the worst was yet to come. In 2004, the case took another shocking turn. Seemingly out of nowhere, the killer struck again, not with another murder, but with another taunt. This time, he left notes at various locations around Fort Wayne. The notes were stuffed inside plastic bags that were even more disturbing than the 1990 message. Along with the handwritten letters, condoms and Polaroid photographs of the man's genitals were used. The notes referenced April by name, and it made clear that this was the same person who had killed her all those years ago. The killer's messages were short and cruel. One note read, "Hi, honey, I have been watching you. I am the same person that kidnapped, raped, and killed April Tinsley. You are my next victim." The notes were left on bicycles, at playgrounds, and in mailboxes, targeting young girls throughout the area. The taunts sent shockwaves of fear through the community once again. Parents who had begun to let their guard down after years of quiet now held their children closer, terrified that the killer would strike again. But despite the killer's boldness in 2004, he once again managed to evade capture. Law enforcement agencies were desperate for leads. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team was called in. It was a specialized unit designed to assist in child abduction cases. Investigators worked hard over the evidence, analyzing the DNA from the used condoms and the handwriting in the notes. But still, the identity of the killer remained a mystery. Years passed with no new developments. April's family held on to hope, but it seemed that justice might never come. The case, now decades old, remained one of Fort Wayne's most notorious unsolved crimes. By 2018, it had been 30 years since April Tinsley's murder, and the case had long been considered a cold one. Investigators had tried everything: traditional detective work, behavioral profiling, and even attempts to lure the killer into making a mistake, but nothing had worked. But in early 2018, they decided to try something new, which was forensic genealogy. This technique involved using DNA evidence to trace a suspect's family tree, and it links them to relatives who had uploaded their genetic information to public databases. It was the same method that had recently been used to catch the Golden State Killer, and now investigators were hoping it would bring them closer to identifying April's killer. The Golden State Killer was a notorious serial killer and rapist who committed a series of crimes in California between the 1970s and 1980s. He is linked to at least 13 murders and over 50 rapes. His identity remained a mystery for decades until he was finally arrested in 2018 through DNA evidence and forensic genealogy. While this method has led to the identification of many cold case victims, including several high-profile cases, it has so far not yielded a match for April Tinsley. Investigators continue to pursue this method as genetic databases grow and the potential for a match increases. In early 2018, the Fort Wayne Police Department partnered with a company called Parabon Nanolabs to analyze the DNA that had been collected from the crime scene and from the 2004 notes. Using forensic genealogy, they were able to trace the DNA to a man named John D. Miller. Miller, a 59-year-old from Grable, Indiana, lived just a few miles from where April's body had been found. He had no prior criminal record, and for decades, he had managed to avoid suspicion. But now, thanks to the DNA evidence, investigators were certain they had found April's killer. On July 15, 2018, detectives knocked on the door of John D. Miller's modest home. The man who answered looked like an average 59-year-old who was messy but not scary. When the detectives identified themselves and asked if he knew why they were there, Miller's response was immediate: April Tinsley. The confession came easily. Miller told detectives that on the day he abducted April, he had been driving around Fort Wayne looking for a victim. He saw April walking alone and made a split-second decision to take her. He brought her to his trailer where he sexually assaulted her. When she started to cry, he panicked and strangled her to death. Miller then placed her body in a nearby ditch where it would remain undiscovered for 3 days. As he spoke, the seriousness of what he had done felt very heavy in the room, but Miller seemed strangely indifferent, as if he were talking about something that didn't matter to him at all. His confession was both disturbing and horrific. The details came out like a scary tale that showed how bad his actions were. As detectives listened, they couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and disgust. After years of searching for the man who had brought so much pain, they had finally found him. But the horror of what he had done left them unsettled.
It's a big win for law enforcement, and this investigation illustrates the dogged determination of the investigators who never wavered, never gave up, and kept moving forward for the last 30 years.
Miller's admission also confirmed what they had long suspected, that April's murderer had been living among them, blending into the community as if he were just another neighbor. Miller was arrested and charged with murder, child molestation, and other related offenses. The news of his arrest sent shockwaves through Fort Wayne and beyond. Local media covered the trial extensively, with many families remembering the fear that had held their community for years. As the trial neared, April Tinsley's family prepared to face John Miller. April's mother, Janet, took the stand, and she was determined to make her daughter's voice heard. She spoke about April's bright personality and the huge emptiness left by her loss.
It's what we've been wanting for so many years, and now it's here. Nowadays you never know, but I am hoping he gets something like what he gave her.
This filled the courtroom with a mother's enduring love and sorrow. Miller's defense team argued he acted out of impulse, struggling with mental health issues. However, the prosecution countered, presenting Miller's detailed confession and DNA evidence that exposed his calculated actions. As the case built, it became clear this was no accident but a planned, horrifying crime. On November 16, 2019, after days of deliberation, the jury found Miller guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to 80 years. For April's family, the verdict offered some justice, but the loss was permanent.